They were here before the gods we worship, before the myths we memorized, before the stories we thought were sacred. They walked through history unnoticed, not because they were hiding, but because we were never ready to see them. They shaped the rise and fall of kingdoms, whispered through the cracks of forgotten ruins, and still, they were dismissed. Marvel introduced us to beings older than belief, and then buried them beneath the noise. The Eternals were not superheroes. They were architects of existence, cosmic sentinels cursed with memory, and yet they were marketed like another popcorn flick, another name to scroll past, another trailer to forget. They held questions too big for the screen, questions about purpose, about silence, about standing still while the world spins. They asked what it means to matter when no one remembers, what it means to serve when no one sees, what it means to love when time makes everything feel temporary. But the world didn't listen. It wanted battles. It wanted multiverses. It wanted cameos and callbacks and chaos. The Eternals offered poetry, and we traded it for spectacle. They gave us gods, and we called them boring. They reached for forever, and we scrolled away. Still, their presence lingers, not in merchandise, not in memes, but in meaning. They were a pause in the storm, a breath between universes, a moment to ask why instead of how. Their silence now feels like mourning, not for themselves, but for what we lost in rushing past them. In this video, we're going to explore why the Eternals were the most important heroes the MCU ever created, and why Marvel chose to ignore them. We'll uncover the philosophical core that was never marketed, the beauty that was never amplified, and the legacy that might be the key to everything still to come. There are stories older than memory, buried beneath myths, woven through stardust and silence, stories of gods who walked like men, who shaped worlds, who chose not to be worshipped, but to serve. The Eternals were not just characters. They were the questions we stopped asking. They watched civilizations rise and fall. They witnessed empires burn and be rebuilt from ash. They stood at the edge of every moment we thought we understood, only to reveal that we knew nothing at all. They weren't heroes in the way we define them. They were something else, something more ancient, more intimate. Each Eternal carried a different philosophy, a different pain, a different truth. They were not a team. They were a tapestry, a reflection of what it means to live forever in a world that changes by the second. Their power wasn't in their strength. It was in their restraint, their silence, their sorrow. The idea that they could have reshaped the entire Marvel universe was never a stretch. It was the original plan. They were the missing links between myth and science, between legend and logic, between the divine and the disposable. And yet, they were treated like guests in their own story. Marvel had something sacred in their hands, and instead of building a cathedral, they rushed out a blueprint and left the door half open. From the first trailer, it was clear the marketing didn't know what it had. A cosmic opera disguised as a superhero flick. A philosophical epic trimmed into a chore checklist. They sold it like a detour, not a destination. Like a filler chapter, not a first page. The cast was stacked with legends. The director held an Oscar. The scope stretched across galaxies, but the message was muffled, buried under forced exposition and fractured pacing. As if Marvel itself didn't trust the audience to understand something different, something patient. The narrative tried to balance spectacle with silence, action with introspection, but in trying to do everything, it ended up doing nothing with conviction. The film spoke softly, but Marvel wanted to shout, and in that disconnect, something was lost. They minimized the gods to make room for cameos. They traded theology for CGI. They clipped wings before the Eternals ever learned to soar. Instead of letting these beings breathe, they trapped them inside a formula that was never meant for them. It wasn't that the Eternals failed to connect, it's that Marvel never gave them the space to be heard in the first place. There is heartbreak in watching potential collapse under pressure. The Eternals were more than a movie. They were a moment to evolve, to elevate, to expand the mythos into something immortal. But what could have been divine was instead diluted. We could have witnessed gods wrestling with purpose, immortals confronting irrelevance, ancient protectors wondering if their silence made them complicit. We could have seen power not as force, but as burden, not as weapon, but as memory. Instead, we were handed fragments, glimpses of greatness, threads left hanging in the wind. We saw sparks of something transcendent, but never the flame, never the warmth, just cold remnants of a story that deserved more. Every frame hinted at depth, but flinched from consequence. Every character carried centuries, but spoke in minutes. The weight of eternity was reduced to a timeline of conveniences, the echo of greatness drowned out by a need to move on quickly. And when the credits rolled, it wasn't closure. It was abandonment. A quiet goodbye to something that never got a proper hello. Still, buried in the noise, the film left echoes worth hearing. The Eternals were visionaries, not just within the narrative, but beyond it. They asked questions no other Marvel story dared to. Who made the rules? Who watches the watchers? What happens when faith becomes doubt? They stood still while the universe spun. Not because they were lazy, but because they were listening. They were protectors of timelines, architects of destiny, each one carved by purpose, torn by guilt, shaped by time. They didn't just fight monsters. They wrestled with morality itself. There was something ethereal in their presence, something sacred in their stillness. They weren't just superhumans, they were symbols. Icarus didn't fall, he ascended into regret. Circe didn't fight. She transformed, not just matter, but meaning. Athena's rage was poetry. Gilgamesh's silence was love. Druig's defiance was protest. Phastos' invention was grief. Macary's speed was devotion. They weren't tropes, they were truths, and each one whispered something eternal. It was a story about what endures, what fades, and what it means to stand between creation and destruction. And even in silence, their presence still lingers. Maybe the Eternals weren't meant to shine immediately. Maybe their purpose was always to plant seeds, to begin a conversation, to leave breadcrumbs through myth and time. They were never supposed to be loud, only lasting. In a universe built on noise, they offered nuance. In a franchise fueled by flash, they brought feeling. And though they were overlooked, they are not gone. They are waiting. Patient, inevitable, a slow-burning star in a sky full of explosions. Their story can still unfold, not with a bang, but with a breath. Not through cameos, but through consequence. They are the origin, not the ornament. The ones who came before, and maybe, the ones who will outlast. Because when everything else has been rewritten, when timelines have twisted, when multiverses have collapsed, the Eternals will still be watching. Not from thrones, but from shadows. Not to intervene, but to remember. And maybe, just maybe, Marvel will remember too. That greatness isn't always loud. Sometimes it just waits. And yet, for all their meaning, the Eternals may never return as they should. Not because they lacked power, but because the world never sat still long enough to hear them speak. Not because they failed, but because the studio blinked. Marvel built a universe on momentum, and the Eternals asked it to pause, to reflect, to ponder. But reflection does not sell like action, and pondering does not trend like punches. So the gods were shelved, and the story scattered. They came with wisdom, and were met with impatience. They brought eternity, and were given a deadline. They were carved from cosmic truth, and reshaped into content, not for lack of value, but for lack of vision. The tragedy is not that they vanished, but that they were never fully seen, never embraced for what they were, only trimmed to fit a mold they were never meant to occupy. A saga of silence, lost in the age of sound. And so they wait, in limbo, forgotten by many, but not by all. A story still untold, a legacy still unfinished. The most important heroes, not because they were loved, but because they were ignored.